a momentous series of events has occurred since we published Hallmarks. Brexit has occurred, and the end of Obama's term as president, the first African American president of the U.S. We've experienced those two phenomena along with the upcoming installation of Donald Trump as president.
Yes, and so we'd love to talk with you a little bit about your thoughts at this historical moment in terms of thinking about where the world is going and the kinds of concerns that I think you have written about and that we see going forward.
Yes, it's a very unpredictable world that we are facing today. And Brexit, and as you said, the election of Donald Trump, and everything that's happening in the world really makes us think about the ways in which we try and negotiate difference. I think one of the key things that is facing us today is the problem of how to negotiate difference. This was something that Stuart Hall also wrote about a lot, and he talks about in his work, as we all know, about the authoritarian populism that he actually identified as a feature of Thatcherism. And I think we find that kind of authoritarian populism is stalking the world, all over the world actually, not just in the North, but also the global South. And under those circumstances, I think what we need to be thinking about is the ways in which the common sense of the people is being organized by this authoritarian populism, in which questions of racism and sexuality, disability, gender, all these aspects feature as something around which this common sense is being organized. And I think what we must do is to actually unpick this common sense and to challenge this common sense and to organize in ways that we can try not to be overweight by its impacts.
When you think about Stuart's work being influenced by so many different intellectual traditions, Marxism, post-colonialism, post-structuralism, and you think about his reflections on neoliberalism, how do you think that has been inflected in your own work?
I think we both were concerned to analyze questions of racism, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, although we didn't call it intersectionality at the time, but that's what we were interested in. And Stuart never used the term intersectionality in his life at all, I think. But he was one of the first people academics that I came across who were Marxists at the time, but wanted to talk about gender alongside class and race, particularly race. Gender not so much explicitly, but certainly race, And he started discussing all the changes that were happening in Britain during the late 1970s and early 1980s. And that he called Thatcherism. This was actually a period when Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister in Britain. And she was favoring a kind of monetaristic policy, and at the economic level, monetarism, and at the political level, authoritarian populism, and culturally, there were all kinds of fears about permissive society and individual. This Thatcherism was very much against social welfareism. They wanted a minimalist state, and these kinds of ideas were very helpful for me. What Stuart Hall was writing about, I really found them very productive to think about questions that I was addressing at the time. But with me and Stuart, I think the difference really was that I was very involved in feminist politics throughout much of my academic life. And therefore, I approached some of these questions from within the feminist analytics, within the gender and women's studies politics. And so my links with Stuart's work were reflected through that angle. So we were similar in our approach, but also different.
I actually would like to ask about, I'd like you to talk a little bit about some of the ways you theorize diaspora and diaspora space, and perhaps talk a bit about some of the ways that people are reconceptualizing notions of diaspora. So maybe starting with, since we are honoring Stuart Hall too, thinking about the ways that he's theorized diaspora and the ways that you've extended some of that thinking.
Yes. Stuart actually used the term diaspora, I think it was in the late 1980s or mid-80s when he first started writing about it. And in Britain, until then, we were called immigrants. All the people who came from the former colonies were known as immigrants. And this was something, even young people born here were referred to as immigrants. And this was something that we were very critical of. Lots of us were very critical of. And Stuart, along with people like Paul Gilroy, started using the term diaspora as a way of, firstly, to interrogate that common sense of the discourse of the immigrant. Also, we were concerned about the ways in which the discourse of the immigrant was framed largely within the nation-state imaginary, whereas people of the diaspora are by definition from more than one different places. And most of us had links all over the world. And so we wanted to think about globalization as a personal experience in a way, in the sense that we were all living in different parts of the world. Also wanted to look at the specific experiences of that migration from what used to be called third world countries, now we call it the global south, migrations from there to the global north. Many people came as labor migrants of the time, and it actually foregrounded the ways in which the global economies of the West needed labor. And they reached out to the former colonies for this labor. So we were considering these questions and to think about these wider questions about migrancy under those different circumstances. The term diaspora seemed a much more appropriate term than immigrant, or one that focused on the national imaginary. I started working on this concept of diaspora. At first, for me, it was just a descriptive term, It was something that diasporics do. People live in countries, different from where they were born. But as I started thinking about it, I suddenly began to realize that actually diaspora could actually be mobilized as a concept, which was distinct from diaspora as a historical experience. That was very important, but you analyze that historical experience with the use of the concept of diaspora. And I theorized diaspora as a series of investigative technologies, heuristic devices that look at the ways in which specific historical migrations have taken shape, how they differ from other migrations, and how different groups of people are treated in the country, in the receiving country. I don't like to call the term host country, though people use the term host, because often these countries were not very host-like. So in the receiving countries, how we were differently treated, even when we were experiencing racism. So for instance, African Caribbean people in Britain and South Asian people in Britain were both racialized. We experienced racism, but there were different types of racism, you know.
Yes.
And ways in which they both united us, but also could divide us. And I think this is something we need to bear in mind even today. Different racisms, they both unite people, but also divide them. And so for me, the term diaspora became as a concept. And then I began thinking about the concept of diaspora and the ways in which borders, both geographical borders, but equally emotional, psychological, political, economical borders, how they impact on our lives, how they actually work on whether or not we are made to feel we belong to a place or not. And that questions of belonging were very central to that. And I was also influenced very strongly by the feminist concept of politics of location, which at the time was very, very important concept, you know, looked at the ways in which we are situated. Intersectionally, we would say today. We didn't use the term intersection, but we talked about politics of location, both in terms of geographical location, but much more in terms of our structural and social location and cultural location. So I put together these three concepts, diaspora, border, and politics of location, and suggested the term diaspora space, which is really about the ways in which different axes of differentiation, and both in terms of psychic, social, cultural, political, how they actually impinge upon our experiences, and how diaspora space is where different groups interact with each other, would confront each other, and it's about what happens when people face each other, when people encounter each other. So it's about social and political and economic encounters. It's about how to become a social being within that context.